They carved a stone with dates that matched my life, but left my name out like it never mattered. I might have walked away, until the caretaker said there was something buried beneath the grave, waiting only for me. I returned to the town after 20 years of distance, not grief, just unfinished quiet. Winter sat low over the fields, and the cemetery looked smaller than I remembered, as if time had folded it inward. I had come to sell what little was left of my family's land, unaware that the ground itself still remembered me. The frost was still holding the ground when I arrived. Could that thin white layer that quiets everything, sound, color, even thought? Yeah, the cemetery gates didn't creak when I pushed them open, they just breathed. And for a moment, it felt like the place had been waiting for me longer than I'd known. I stopped walking when I saw the stone. I hadn't planned to come this early. Dawn just happened to me, the way it used to when I was a boy, uninvited but steady. The sky was pale and unsure, like it hadn't decided whether to stay night or become morning. My breath came out in small clouds, and each step pressed a darker shape into the frost. I knew where my parents were buried. Everyone does, even after years away. You carry places like that in your body. But I hadn't expected how small the plot would look, how close the stone sat to the path, as if it didn't want attention. I stood there for a while before reading anything. The cold crept up through my boots, slow and patient. Somewhere far off, a crow called once, then went quiet again. The stone was clean, newer than I expected. Gray granite polished just enough to catch the weak light. My father's name on the left. My mother's on the right, dates carved deep, precise. Someone had paid for good work. Between them, nothing. No name, no dash, no space waiting to be filled. And just smooth stone rubbed flat like it had never been touched by a chisel. I leaned in closer, my glove brushing the surface. It felt warmer than the air, like it had been handled recently. No one warned me, no letter, no call, nothing to prepare me for the fact that I was standing at my parents' grave, and I did not exist on it. I heard footsteps behind me before I saw him, slow, careful, someone who knew where they were going. The caretaker stopped a few feet away, hands folded in front of him, like he wasn't sure if this counted as work or prayer. He was older than I remembered caretakers being. Or maybe the job ages you faster. Morning, he said. His voice sounded thick in the cold. I nodded, still facing the stone. Morning. There was a pause, long enough for me to feel it settle between us. I think there's a mistake, I said finally. He didn't answer right away. I turned then. He was looking past me, toward the trees, toward anywhere but my face, my name, I said. It's supposed to be here. I tapped the blank space lightly with my knuckle. The sound was dull, absorbed. The caretaker shifted his weight. His boots made a soft crunch in the frost. He cleared his throat once, like he'd practiced that part. There's no mistake, he said. I waited. The cold climbed higher, biting at my ears now. I pulled my coat tighter without realizing it. The stone was placed exactly as requested. The stone was placed exactly as requested, he added. Rested by who? He hesitated. Just a fraction too long. And by someone who knew you, he said. The words landed heavier than the cold. Someone who knew me. Not of me, knew me. I searched his face for something, confusion, regret, anything, but he kept his eyes down, focused on the ground like it might give him permission to stay quiet. They asked for it this way, he said softly, very clear about it. I turned back to the stone. The frost was starting to melt now, tiny beads of water catching the light. It looked like the grave was sweating. Did they say why? I asked. The caretaker shook his head. No. Another pause, this one heavier, they said. He began, then stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. They said you'd understand when the time came. I laughed then. Not loud, not angry. Just a breath that came out wrong. I've been gone 20 years, I said. If this is understanding, it came late. He didn't argue. I crouched down, bringing myself level with the stone. The smooth space between my parents' names reflected my face faintly, distorted. Like a memory that had been handled too much, someone had made a decision not out of neglect, but care. The stone wasn't unfinished, it was intentionally complete. That was the part that hurt. Erasure is easy when it's careless. This wasn't careless, this was chosen. I tried to think of who could do that, who would stand where I was standing now and decide I should be remembered without being named. Someone close enough to think they had the right, someone who believed they were protecting something or protecting someone for spurs a bird to nubixashtik. Is that all? I asked. The caretaker hesitated again. This time longer. Whatever tiver ting ting tai, there's more, he said. My hand stilled against the stone. Can tired, Kantake Workhouse Shanatic Tuthamation. Oh, a kind of more. He finally looked at me then, really looked. His eyes weren't unkind, just tired. Like this moment had been sitting on his back for a while. Not here, he said. Not yet the berry side for might the last. Not yet. I stood slowly. The world felt tilted, like the ground had shifted without moving. Then when? I asked. He glanced at the sky, now pale blue, the sun barely lifting above the trees. When you're ready, he said. I stayed after he left, long enough for the frost to fully disappear, long enough for the cemetery to wake up. The sound of a distant car, a dog barking somewhere beyond the fence. Kenna, I traced my parents' names once more, the dates, the edges. Then I placed my hand over the blank space between them. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a pause, a held breath. And as I stepped away, I realized something unsettling and quiet settle into me. Someone hadn't erased me to forget me. Yokang, they had erased me to wait, and whatever came next had been buried deeper than stone. The wind came up without warning. One moment the air was still holding the cemetery in place. The next, it moved through the trees like a whisper that didn't want to be heard. Dry leaves dragged across stone. Branches knocked softly against each other. The caretaker stopped walking, not abruptly, just enough for me to notice. He stood there with his back to me, shoulders slightly hunched, as if he'd been waiting for that sound before deciding what came next. Kekat, we were the only two people left in the cemetery. The gates had closed behind the early visitors, and the path had gone quiet again. The frost was mostly gone now, but the ground still held the cold underneath. You could feel it through your shoes. Patient and unmoving, the caretaker finally turned. His face looked older up close. Lines carved deep like he'd spent years squinting into weather he couldn't control. I was told not to speak, he said. He said it carefully, like each word had been weighed before it left his mouth. Not unless you came back alone, King. I didn't respond right away. I watched his hands instead. They were clasped together, knuckles pale. A man trying to keep something contained. Who told you that? I asked. He shook his head. Doesn't matter now. Ka, his eyes flicked toward the main path, then back to me, as if he expected someone to appear and stop him, as if the cemetery itself might object. I was told to wait, he continued, and to watch. The word sat between us. Watch. Again, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. How long? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Since the stone went in, I nodded once, even though the answer didn't settle anything. Time feels different in places like this. Years compress, days stretch. He turned and began walking again, this time angling behind the grave, not toward the road, not toward any marker I recognized. Come on, he said. Behind the stone, the ground dipped slightly. A shallow place where water gathered after rain. The grass there was thinner, more stubborn. Like it had learned not to grow too attached, the caretaker moved slowly, each step measured. It didn't feel cautious, it felt practiced. As if he'd walked the exact path many times in his head. As if he'd walked this exact path many times in his head. Ken, he stopped and pointed with his foot. There, he said. I looked down. There was nothing to distinguish the spot. No marker, no disturbance, just earth, hardened by cold. Under this? I asked. He nodded. What's under it? Kyank. His shoulders lifted, then fell. That surprised me. You buried it, I said. Yes. Ken, so you must. I didn't look, he said quietly. I looked at him then. He wasn't lying. His eyes were steady, earnest, almost apologetic. I was told not to, he added. It was wrapped, sealed. They said it wasn't meant for anyone else. The wind picked up again, stronger this time. It pressed against my coat, slid down my collar. I could hear it move through the trees, circling us. Cat, who told you? I asked again. He hesitated. Just for a second. Someone who loved you, he said. Yeah. That did something to my chest, tightened it, not sharply, just enough to remind me it was there. Ak loved me enough to bury something, I asked. Loved you enough to wait, he replied. We stood there in silence. The caretaker didn't rush me. Mun washed. Die! He didn't fill the space with explanation. He just waited. Hands folded again, eyes lowered. I stared at the ground. There's a difference between being watched and feeling observed. Watched implies eyes. Observed feels older than that. Like the land itself has an opinion. I imagined hands pressing the soil down, a shovel striking frozen earth, breath fogging the air just like mine was now. Someone standing exactly where I stood, knowing I wasn't there to see it. Same day as the stone? I asked. Yes. Before or after, he thought for a moment. After the names were carved. After the blank space was smoothed clean, I swallowed. Did they say when I'd come back? I asked. He shook his head. They just said you would. The certainty in his voice unsettled me more than doubt would have. The scan as apch Khan a Shanter Mangsert Hound Sapphirus, the once a salad in 200 Bruken. I crouched slightly, resting my hands on my knees. The earth looked solid, unbroken, unwilling. What if I hadn't? I asked. Nah. The caretaker's answer came without pause, then it would have stayed here, forever. The wind died down suddenly. The quiet rushed in to take its place. In that stillness I heard my own breathing, slow, careful, like I was afraid of waking something. I realized then that whatever was buried here wasn't meant to be found out of curiosity. It wasn't insurance or proof or leverage, it was waiting for recognition. For me to stand in the right place. Alone, you don't have a shovel, I said. He nodded. That's on purpose. My hands flexed inside my gloves, cold, already aching. Why tell me now? I asked. He met my Gamaya. He met my eyes again. This time, he didn't look away. He didn't look away, because the waiting part is over, he said. He stepped back, giving me space, not far, just enough to show this part wasn't his anymore. I didn't kneel, not yet. I stood there, listening to the cemetery settle again, a crow somewhere. The faint hum of a road I couldn't see beneath my feet. The ground held its silence. Ken, I had come looking for a name. I found a pause instead. Whatever was buried there had been placed carefully, intentionally, with trust that I would return not as a visitor, but as someone ready to touch what had been hidden. I looked down at my hands. They were already cold, already tired. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood something clearly. This grave wasn't keeping me out. It was keeping something safe until I was ready to reach for it. The ground didn't look disturbed. That was the first thing I noticed. No loose soil, no broken grass, just earth lying the way it always had, pressed flat by time and weather. I knelt anyway, the cold finding me immediately, seeping through denim and bone like it had been waiting its turn. The wind had gone quiet again, too quiet. I remember thinking how strange it was, how much sound there had been just moments ago, and how suddenly the world had decided to listen instead. Kneeling there felt different than standing, more honest maybe, or more vulnerable. My knees sank just slightly into the damp ground, and I could feel the chill spread up my legs. Low and deliberate. I shrugged out of my coat and laid it beside me. The fabric darkened where it touched the soil. I didn't care. Some things don't stay clean once you decide to touch them. I pressed my gloved hands into the earth. It resisted. Not dramatically, just enough to remind me it had been here longer than I had, longer than my parents, longer than whatever had been placed beneath it. The caretaker stood a few steps back. I could feel his presence without looking. He didn't speak, didn't shift his weight. He gave me a quiet like it was part of the arrangement. I thought about stopping and about standing up and walking away, but my hands were already dirty. I pulled the gloves off and tucked them into my pocket. My fingers stung immediately, the cold biting hard now that there was nothing between us. The soil felt rough, gritty, alive with resistance. Each scrape of my nails sounded louder than it should have. Like the ground was amplifying the intrusion, I worked slowly, carefully, as if speed might offend something. The dirt was packed tight, layered with years of compression. It didn't crumble. It peeled away in thin, stubborn sheets. I used my fingers at first, then the edge of my palm, scraping and pulling, piling the soil to one side. My breath came out heavier now, small clouds rising and vanishing before they had time to mean anything. After a few minutes, my hands started to ache. Not sharply, just a dull, spreading numbness. The kind that doesn't ask permission. I paused, flexed my fingers, then went back to it. And there was a rhythm to it. Dig, pause, breathe, dig again. The caretaker cleared his throat behind me, then thought better of it. The sound stopped halfway out. How deep? I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Not far, he said eventually. They said you'd feel it. I almost smiled at that. Almost I pressed my fingers deeper, ignoring the cold now. It had become background noise, something steady, something manageable, then a sound not loud, not sharp. I brushed the soil away more carefully now, fingertips trembling slightly. Not from fear, I told myself, but from the cold. The object revealed itself slowly, reluctantly. A small tin, no bigger than a lunch pail, rusted along the edges. Dull with age, it was wrapped once in oilcloth, faded brown, cracked at the folds. I sat back on my heels, staring at it like it might move on its own. The caretaker didn't come closer. You found it, he said. Not a question. I lifted the tin gently, surprised by its weight, heavier than it looked, like it carried more than metal should. The oilcloth crackled softly as I set it on my coat. The sound felt loud in the quiet, inappropriate. My fingers hovered over the latch. I didn't open it. Instead, I just sat there, hands resting on my knees, breathing slowly. I could hear my pulse in my ears now. Steady, insistent. I thought about all the times I'd left things unopened. Letters, conversations, doors. I thought about how much effort it takes to bury something properly, the planning, the intention, the belief that the future will cooperate. This was buried the same day as the stone, I asked. Yes. Nanai or Nana Ben, I asked. He shook his head decayed, then nodded once, Nanda Parke. Who brought it? I asked. He shook his head. They did. They? He hesitated, then nodded once. More than one. Eh? That settled something heavy in my chest. This wasn't a secret one person carried alone. This was shared. I rested my hand on the tin. The metal was cold, familiar somehow. Like a tool I'd once owned but couldn't quite remember using. What if I don't open it? I asked. The caretaker's voice came soft, almost kind. Then it stays quiet, he said, quiet, quirt. I closed my eyes. The past has a sound when it's ready to speak. It hums, low and persistent. It doesn't shout. It waits. I opened my eyes again and looked at the latch. Once I opened it, there would be no way to pretend I hadn't touched it. No way to return this moment to the ground. The caretaker took a step back, giving me space. This part, he said, was never meant for me. I nodded. I understood that now. I didn't open the tin right away. I wrapped it back in the oilcloth, careful with the brittle folds, and held it against my chest. The cold seeped through my coat and into me, but I welcomed it. It kept me present, grounded. The hole in the earth waited beside me, dark and patient, like it knew this wasn't finished yet. I stood slowly, brushing dirt from my hands. The soil clung to my skin, refusing to let go entirely. As I turned away from the grave, the tin heavy in my arms, I felt something shift. Not loud, not sudden. Just a quiet understanding settling into place. Whatever was inside that tin had been waiting a long time. And now that it was awake, the silence behind me felt thinner, like it wouldn't hold much longer. I didn't open the tin right away. I set it on the passenger seat and let it ride there in silence, like a quiet companion that didn't ask questions. The car smelled faintly of cold air and old upholstery. My breath fogged the windshield, even though the engine was running. At a red light, I rested my hand on the lid, metal, solid, unforgiving. Some things don't ask to be remembered, they wait to be recognized. I parked at the edge of town near the empty lot where the old feed store used to stand. Nothing left now but gravel and weeds bent sideways by the wind. It felt like a place that wouldn't mind if I stayed a while. I turned the engine off. The sudden quiet rang in my ears. The tin sat between my knees as I pried it open. The hinge protested softly, a tired sound like it hadn't been used since the day it was sealed. Inside there was no clutter, no keepsakes, no stack of papers tied with string, just one letter, folded small, folded tight. The creases were sharp enough to feel permanent, like they'd been pressed down with intention, not habit. I lifted it out carefully, as if sudden movement might undo something fragile. My name was written on the front. Not typed, not stamped, written. I knew the handwriting before I fully saw it, the slight lean to the right, the careful spacing, letters shaped like they'd been taught, not improvised, my mother's hand. The paper carried a smell that stopped me cold. Cedar and faint smoke. The exact scent of the old house in winter, when the stove worked harder than it should have. I closed my eyes without meaning to. For a moment, I wasn't meaning to. For a moment, I wasn't in the car anymore. I held the letter between my fingers, turning it slowly. The edges were soft, worn thin by time or touch. It had been unfolded before, then folded again, carefully, as if she'd wanted it to be small enough to hide, but not forgotten. I didn't open it. Instead, I rested it on my palm and stared through the windshield at nothing in particular. The sky was low and gray now, pressing down on the town. A truck passed on the main road, its tires hissing on damp pavement. I thought about mailboxes, cans, about how many times I'd checked mine over the years, even when I knew there wouldn't be anything from home. How hope doesn't announce itself. It just shows up quietly, dressed like habit. Why didn't she send it? The question didn't arrive with anger. It came softly, almost respectfully. I imagined her at the kitchen table, pen moving slow, stopping often, folding the paper once, then twice, maybe unfolding it again to add something, maybe crossing something out. I imagined her standing at the cemetery later, letter tucked into her coat pocket, choosing soil over postage. My thumb traced the fold again. Some letters are meant to travel, others are meant to wait. The car ticked as it cooled. Somewhere nearby, a flagpole clinked in the wind. I thought about opening the letter right there, in the front seat, knees cramped, steering wheel cold against my chest. Thought felt wrong, rushed. This wasn't something to This wasn't something to be skimmed, this was something to sit with. I drove to the old house without deciding to. The driveway was narrower than I remembered, gravel popping under the tires. The porch sagged slightly on one side like it was tired of pretending I didn't go inside. Akananged. I sat on the front steps instead, the wood creaking beneath me like it recognized the weight. The door behind me stayed closed. That felt right. Tapermain me stayed closed. That felt right. The letter rested in my lap. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and leaves. Underneath it, that same trace of smoke. Memory doesn't fade evenly. It leaves pockets behind. I held the letter up again, reading my name once more. Saying it silently, she knew where I was. She must have. Even if she didn't have an address, she had ways people talk, names surface. Okay, unless sending it would have changed something she wasn't ready to disturb. Kent, I realized then that burying it wasn't an act of abandonment. It was an act of restraint. She didn't want to interrupt the life I was building away from her. Or the story others had decided to tell. This letter wasn't meant to reach me out there. It was meant to meet me here. I leaned my head back against the door and closed my eyes. For the first time since returning, I felt her presence. Not heavy, not haunting, just close. Like she was in the next room giving me time. I understood something quietly, without ceremony. She buried the letter because she believed I'd come back on my own terms, not summoned. I didn't open the letter that day. I slid it back into the tin, folded exactly the way she had left it. The creases lined up perfectly, like they remembered their place. As the light faded, I watched the house grow darker window by window. The porch boards cooled beneath me. The air thickened with evening. Somewhere inside that folded paper was a truth she trusted me to meet when I was ready. Not before, not rushed. Ekazenka. I stood finally, tin in hand, and locked the door even though no one lived there anymore. The letter stayed closed, but it didn't feel silent, it felt patient. And as I walked back down the steps, I knew the next time I unfolded it, something in me would unfold too. The heater clicked on and off like it was thinking too hard, a small sound easy to ignore. But in the quiet of the car, it felt loud enough to matter. I sat there with the letter resting on the steering wheel, both hands flat against the paper. Outside, dusk pressed its face to the glass. The windows fogged slowly, as if the car was trying to keep what was inside from escaping. I hadn't planned to read it there, but the stillness made the decision for me. I'd parked beneath an old maple just outside town, the kind that drops leaves long before the others. The branches were bare now, thin fingers scratching lightly against the roof when the wind shifted. The engine idled low. The heater breathed warm air against my ankles, steady and patient. It reminded me of winter mornings when my mother would let the car run before waking me for school. I used to pretend I was still asleep just to stay in that warmth a little longer. The letter lay unopened for days before this. I carried it with me, from the house to the store, back again. Like a weight I wasn't ready to set down, tonight felt different. The car was small enough to hold the moment, no corners for the past to hide in. No doorways to stand behind. I picked the letter up and smoothed it once, the crease lines guiding my fingers. My name stared back at me, familiar, careful. I took a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, then I unfolded it. The paper resisted at first, stiff from years of staying exactly the way it was told. When it finally opened, it made a sound like a quiet sigh. Her handwriting filled the page, neat, controlled. A little smaller than I remembered, as if she'd been trying to save space or time. My son Hal? It began. Commence about schmeen frinks, of gab dissematching stensipend sigh of naponchers of dapper for. Just that, no explanation, no greeting, no apology. The heater clicked again. The sound punctuated the silence between words. She wrote about the night I left, not dramatically, just facts, the hour, the weather, the way the house felt after the door closed behind me. She wrote that she stood at the sink long after, hands submerged in cold water, listening for a sound that didn't come. Then the letter shifted. She wrote about the things she was told, afterward, the visits, the phone calls that came late, voices lowered like they were already in mourning. She said people spoke gently to her, carefully, as if I were fragile glass already shattered. They told her I wasn't coming back. They told her it was better that way. I stopped reading. My hands had gone tight around the paper. The edges crumpled slightly under my fingers. The heater hummed. I stared at the dashboard. The faint dust settled into its grooves. This car had seen a lot of waiting. I wondered if it remembered. I forced myself to keep going. She wrote about being asked to choose. Not in so many words. But the meaning was there. APC, they called it. Cromlation, letting things rest. They said truth would only reopen wounds, that some things once spoken refused to lie back down. She wrote that she was tired, that grief makes you believe rest is the same thing as healing. Can't. So she chose peace. She didn't write, I was wrong. She didn't write, forgive me. Yeah, she wrote, I thought silence would keep everyone safe. The words sat heavy on the page. She explained how the story took shape without her correcting it, how each repetition smoothed its edges, how my absence grew more complete with time. She wrote that my name was spoken less and less, until it became easier not to say it at all. Then came the line that made my breath catch. They asked me not to reach you, not demanded, not threatened, asked. She said they promised things would settle if she didn't disturb what had already been decided, that life would move forward if she let it. She said she agreed. The heater clicked off. The sudden quiet pressed in hard. My chest felt tight, not sharply, just enough to make breathing feel deliberate. This wasn't a letter of regret, it was a record, a confession offered without asking for absolution. She wrote that she lived with the choice every day, that it followed her through rooms, sat beside her at night. That silence is loud when you've agreed to it willingly. She wrote that bearing the letter felt like the only honest place to put it. Yeah, some truths, she said, don't survive daylight. I folded the paper slightly, then stopped myself, smoothed it again. The truth she buried wasn't just about me leaving, it was about who stayed behind and why. I didn't finish the letter in one sitting. I folded it back along the same creases, careful to return it to its shape. The paper felt warmer now, like it had absorbed something from me. Outside, the streetlight flickered on. The maple shadow stretched long across the hood of the car. I sat there with my hands resting on the folded page, listening to the heater come back to life. Cumberlas ting davered the life. My mother had chosen peace over truth, but she didn't choose forgetting. She chose waiting. Waiting for me to stand still long enough to hear what silence had been holding. As I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, one thought followed me home, quiet and steady. If this was the truth she buried, what else had been laid down beside it, believing I'd someday return to listen? The house appeared slowly, the way old things do. First the roofline through bare branches, then the porthole, then the windows, dark and unblinking. I eased the car to the shoulder and let it idle, as if the engine might disturb something fragile. The paint was peeling, curling away in long, tired strips, but the walls were straight. The bones still held. Yeah, it was still standing. I don't know why that surprised me. Psych. I think part of me believed it would be gone, it had followed me out of town and never come back. I shut the engine off and sat there for a moment longer than necessary. The silence settled in layers. Wind in the trees, a loose shutter tapping somewhere down the road, my own breathing, uneven at first, then steady. I stepped out and the gravel shifted beneath my feet, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. Every place has a sound it keeps just for you. This one remembered my weight. And the front door was locked, but the key still fit. I didn't smile at that, it felt too intentional. Like the house had been waiting, same as the letter, same as the ground. Bracken. Inside, the air was stale but not rotten. Dust hung in the light pouring through the front window, drifting slowly, like it was unsure whether it was allowed to move. The floor creaked under my boots, soft but insistent. The house felt smaller. Not because it had changed, but because I stood in the entryway and listened. Houses make noise when you return to them, pipes settle, wood adjusts, they don't rush you. I didn't call out. There was no need. Every room felt quieter than I remembered. Like sound itself had learned restraint here. As if laughter had once been loud enough to leave a mark, and everything since had been careful not to repeat it. I walked slowly, touching things without really meaning, to the back of a chair, the edge of the counter, the door frame where pencil marks still faintly tracked my height from year to year. The kitchen clock was gone. The hook where it used to hang was still there, bent slightly to the left. I remembered the sound it made. Too loud at night, my father never fixed it. In the living room, the couch sat covered with a sheet. The pattern beneath pressed faintly through, like something trying to remember itself. I didn't lift it. Some things don't need to be seen again to be known. The hallway felt narrow. The walls closer together than before. Each step echoed softly, the floor responding like it recognized the rhythm. At the end of the hall was my bedroom. The door stuck when I pushed it open. Just like it always had, I used my shoulder without thinking. It gave way with a familiar complaint. The room smelled faintly of dust and old fabric. Sunlight slipped through the curtain, landing on the floor in a pale rectangle. The bed was still there, and folded neatly at the foot, the quilt. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to. My eyes adjusted slowly, taking in details I hadn't planned on noticing. The bookshelf half empty. The poster still pinned crookedly on the wall, its corners yellowed. The quilt drew me forward. I reached for it with both hands, lifting it carefully. It was heavier than it looked. the fabric worn thin in places, softened by use. I recognized the stitching immediately, uneven in a way that had always annoyed my mother. Whoa. Heck, she'd mentioned it in the letter, just once, almost in passing. I kept your quilt, not made, not found, kept. Okay, I sat on the edge of the bed and laid the quilt across my lap. My fingers traced the seams, the pattern stitched without a ruler. I remembered sitting at the table while she worked on it, the radio low, her glasses slipping down her nose. If she hadn't thrown it away, hadn't packed it up, she'd left it here waiting. Tikin sai fucking K. I looked around the room again, really looked this time, the desk drawer slightly open, the floorboard near the window darker than the others, a place where something had been spilled once and never quite cleaned. This room had held conversations that didn't make it into memory, softened by time, decisions made quietly after lights were out. The house had witnessed everything. It had seen the night I left, the way my mother stood in the hallway afterward, the way she didn't follow. It had heard the phone calls that came later. The one she took in the kitchen, voice low, eyes on the floor. I pressed the quilt against my chest. The house hadn't judged, it had just kept standing. I stayed until the light shifted, until the sun dipped low enough to stretch shadows across the floor. The dust settled again, slow and patient. Before leaving, I folded the quilt and placed it back exactly where it had been. Not because I didn't want it, but because it felt wrong to take it yet. Like removing it would disturb a balance I was only beginning to understand. I closed the bedroom door gently. The latch caught with a soft click. As I stepped back onto the porch, the air felt cooler. The house loomed behind me, quiet and whole, holding more than it revealed. It hadn't collapsed under the weight of what it knew. And as I walked away, one thought stayed with me, steady and unresolved. If these walls could remember so much in silence, what else was still waiting inside, believing I'd come back to ask? Okay, the front gate groaned as I pushed it open, the sound small but accusing in the still morning. Frost lingered in the hollows of the garden, glittering faintly under the rising sun. I hesitated on the path, hands in my coat pockets, noticing how familiar the smell of damp leaves and cold earth felt, as if the world hadn't moved without me. From behind the kitchen window, a figure stirred. I could see her shoulders rise and fall with each slow breath. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, but when her eyes met mine, the recognition was instant, quiet, deliberate, and I knew she remembered. I stepped onto the porch carefully. The wood groaned underfoot, reminding me that everything here carried its own weight, its own memory. The neighbor, Mrs. Langley, stood behind the door, one hand on the frame, pretending to fuss with her apron. She was smaller than I remembered, bent with years and habit, but the sharpness in her eyes hadn't faded. Inside, the house smelled faintly of tea and old wood, the scent of years held in the corners. She motioned to a chair by the table. I sat, feeling the familiar stiffness of old furniture. Her kettle clinked against the stove. Steam curled in thin, trembling ribbons, rising like smoke from a candle that didn't quite burn. The morning light slanted through the window, slicing the kitchen into lines of gold and shadow. I could see dust motes drifting in the beams, catching on the tension that had already settled in the room. She didn't ask why I was here. I didn't offer. Some explanations aren't spoken aloud. I watched her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Every wrinkle and vein told its own story. I remembered a time when this house had seemed larger, warmer. The memory pressed against the present, heavier than I expected. "Tea?" she asked finally. Her voice was soft, hesitant, and faintly lined with surprise. She moved to the kettle, pouring weak liquid into a chipped cup. The clatter of porcelain against porcelain felt loud in the quiet room. I nodded, my fingers tightening around my own cup once it was placed before me. The steam rose, carrying with it the faintest hint of honey and something I couldn't name. Familiar, though. She watched me as I sipped. For a moment, it seemed as though she wanted to speak but held back. Then she began slowly. "I remember the night you left," she said, shouting. Doors slammed. The wind carrying voices into the yard. It was loud enough to make everyone pause. I looked down at the tea. The warmth seeped into my palms. I tried to absorb the calm she offered, but the memory she was giving me didn't match what I had been told. She paused, then added, "Some stories, they change hands before they settle, what you were told. It's not all of it, not even close." I looked up at her. Her eyes were sharp now, unblinking. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Nouner non ver raming furs and nine anand." I asked quietly, "Why did it get twisted?" She shook her head slowly. "Easier. Easier for some people if the truth was rewritten, easier than dealing with what actually happened." I let her words settle. Easier than what? I didn't ask aloud. I didn't need to. She leaned back in her chair, lifting her cup slowly. Her fingers trembled slightly against the handle. Your absence, she said, more to herself than to me, made it simpler. People could pretend, could smooth edges, could forget to look at what they had done. The tea sloshed faintly in my cup as I shifted. Silence hung between us, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the wall clock and the soft wind tapping against the window. You always thought it was about them, she continued, about who yelled, who walked away, but it wasn't. It was about all the quiet choices in between, choices that change everything. I remembered my mother's letter, the confession folded inside the tin, the letter she had buried. The choices she had made to protect some and to silence others, and the argument, I asked. You remember it differently? She nodded. Different in part, but the shouting, that part's the same. You left. Doors slammed. And some people, they carried on as if the world had ended, except it hadn't. Not really. They just stopped noticing who was missing. And I stared down at the table, at the wood grain that ran like old scars. The house smelled stronger now, of tea, dust, and memory. The quiet pressed in, patient and unyielding. Kakem. Her gaze met mine again. There was no judgment, only remembrance. Some things were easier because you weren't there, she said softly. Easier to sweep under the floorboards. I felt the weight of that statement, the truth buried in my absence, in the silence between the walls, in the spaces that people refused to speak aloud. The tea had grown lukewarm, but I didn't move to refill it. I placed the cup back on the saucer, careful not to make a sound. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the trees, shadows flicking across the walls. Mrs. Langley didn't speak again. She sat quietly, hands folded, watching me, as if she could see into the spaces I hadn't yet dared to enter. I understood, finally, that some stories wait for you to return, not for someone to tell them quickly or neatly, but for you to sit still long enough to notice the gaps. I rose slowly, thanking her without words. The floor creaked under my boots. The door swung gently behind me. As I stepped onto the gravel path, I glanced back at the kitchen window. Her figure remained, small and patient, holding a truth I was only beginning to understand. And in that quiet, I realized what had been easier for them might not be easier for me. What else had been swept under the floorboards, waiting for me to find it? The clock on his wall was still ticking when I arrived, loud enough to feel like a pulse. Afternoon light slipped through half-closed blinds, cutting the room into careful stripes. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere, a floorboard sighed. Somewhere, a door remembered being shut. I thought of the paper that said I was gone and wondered, how ink could be so final while a heart kept going. I knocked once, softly, as if the house might refuse to hear me. He answered after a moment, slower than I expected. The man in the doorway was older than the one I carried in my head. Smaller, too. His shoulders had rounded, and his hair had thinned into a pale fringe that caught the light. He looked at me the way people look at something they thought they'd packed away, surprised, but not confused. Come in, he said, stepping aside. Inside, the air was warm and dry, carrying the smell of old books and furniture polish. The living room felt preserved, not lived in. Gupert I. West photographs lined the mantel, faces smiling toward a past that had learned to stay put. He gestured to a chair. I sat, the cushion sank under me with a tired exhale. We didn't start with names. We didn't start with the past. He folded his hands, then unfolded them. The clock kept ticking. I could hear a car pass outside, the soft rush of tires on gravel. Normal sounds. The kind that make you wonder why some moments refuse to be normal at all. I had rehearsed questions on the drive over. They scattered now, like birds startled from a wire. What stayed was a single, steady feeling, something between dread and calm. I had come to see the man who signed me away, the man who made it official, the man who told the world I was gone. I know why you're here, he said finally. His voice was thin, careful. He didn't look at me when he said it. I nodded. My hands rested on my knees. They felt steady, which surprised me. You signed the papers, I said. I kept my voice low, not accusing, just true. You said I was gone. He breathed out through his nose, a sound like air leaving a room that had been closed too long. Yes. The word landed between us and stayed there. It was necessary, he added. At the time, necessary. The word echoed softly, touching the walls, the photographs, the quiet. I watched his hands as he spoke. The skin was thin now, almost translucent. Blue veins mapped their way across his knuckles. Necessary for what? I asked. Okay. He hesitated, his eyes lifted to mine, then drifted away. For reputation, he said. For inheritance. For... Silence. The clock ticked on, he cleared his throat, things were complicated, there were expectations, people who didn't want questions, people who didn't want disruption. I thought of the letter folded too many times, of my mother choosing peace over truth, of neighbors lowering their voices when my name came up, if it came up at all, and me, I asked. Where did I fit into what was necessary? He looked at me then, really looked. His eyes were tired. Not hard, not defiant, just worn like a chair that had held too much weight for too long. Jag kärden stenen senator Polfen Gorch, and a dad of those cents, have mer dafern dan a modern nondis wok. You were the problem, he said quietly, and the solution. The words didn't sting the way I expected. They settled instead, heavy but familiar. I had lived inside them without knowing their shape. You didn't verftampt the Persian sabak faprization, not once there's definite deny. You didn't deny it, I said. Not once there's nothing to deny, he replied. I did what I did. The clock ticked. Somewhere a pipe clicked as heat moved through it. I felt the room lean in. If it was all so necessary, I said, why do you look? Relieved? His mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something close to it, but unfinished, because, he said after a moment, I didn't think I'd ever see you again. He leaned back in his chair. It creaked beneath him. You disappear someone long enough, you start believing the story yourself. You start thinking maybe you were right. You thinking maybe it was kinder that way, Kinder. The word felt thin now? I asked. Now, he said, you're sitting here, breathing, looking at me like I'm not a story, but a person who made a choice. He swallowed. His throat moved. It's a relief to have the truth stand up and knock. I thought of the grave without my name, of the tin, of the letter that waited so long to be read. Did it cost you anything? I asked. He considered the question. His gaze drifted to the photographs on the mantel. He studied them as if counting what remained. Yes, he said, just not in ways anyone could see. The room felt smaller then, or maybe it was me taking up less space. I realized I had expected anger or satisfaction. What I felt instead was a quiet understanding that some people make rooms of their lives and then spend years afraid to open the doors. When I stood to leave, he rose too. Slowly, the effort showed. He walked me to the door, stopping just short of the threshold. I don't know what you'll do now, he said. I don't know what comes next. Neither did I. Outside, the light had shifted. Evening gathered itself along the street, softening the edges of houses and trees. I stepped onto the porch and felt the boards hold me. Behind me, he lingered. If you ever want to talk, he said. The sentence trailed off. Unfinished, I nodded. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. As I walked away, the clock inside kept ticking. I didn't look back. I carried the quiet with me, along with a new question that pressed gently but firmly against my chest. If my disappearance had been necessary, what truth had been waiting for my return? The frost had retreated slightly from the graves, leaving glistening patches that caught the pale sunlight. I stood at the edge of the cemetery path, the letter heavy in my coat pocket. The cold air pressed against my face, sharp and clean, carrying a faint scent of damp earth. I drew a slow breath, tasting it, feeling the quiet of the morning fill the spaces inside me that had been hollow for years. For the first time in a long time, I whispered my name aloud. It rolled over the frost like a leaf over still water, and I listened as it settled into the silence, small and deliberate. I walked between the headstones, boots crunching against the gravel. The caretaker was nearby, leaning against the tool shed, hands folded. He didn't speak at first, only watching as I approached the blank stone, the one without my name, the one that had always felt like a wound carved into the ground. I knelt briefly at the base, brushing frost from the grass. My fingers lingered on the cold soil, tracing the edges where the stone met the earth. The letter in my pocket felt heavier than the tin it had come from, as though every folded crease carried the weight of my mother's voice and the years I had been absent. I could hear the faint stirring of trees in the wind, a low susurration that sounded almost like the cemetery itself breathing. Somewhere beyond the far fence, a bird called. Its cry was sharp, startling in the stillness, and then the quiet returned. It seemed appropriate, this silence. Like a moment waiting for something to be corrected, I turned to the caretaker. We should replace the stone, I said softly. My voice felt foreign in this place, as though the words themselves were reclaiming space. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the ground. It can be done, he said. We just need to decide how much to restore. I swallowed. My name, I said. It needs to be there, finally. He didn't speak immediately, only adjusted the cap on his head and shifted his weight. Then he looked at me, really looked, and I saw the careful restraint in his expression. Some things can be restored, he said, but a name alone. It can't undo time. It can't bring back what was lost. I let the words drift through me. I understood that. Still, I had to try, had to mark the truth somewhere, even if it was only stone and letters. We walked together to the stone. I traced my fingers across the empty space where my name should have been, imagining it carved deep, solid, undeniable. It's more than just letters, I said. It's acknowledged. It's recognition. Okay. He nodded again, silent, letting me speak, letting the cold wind carry the sound of my voice over the graves. Cal. The caretaker reached into the shed and pulled out a small notebook. He flipped it open, revealing sketches, measurements, and notes about the cemetery. We can have a new stone, he said. Or we can add an inset, something that lasts, something that doesn't erase you. I knelt once more, imagining the act itself. The mason chiseling into the rock, the letters filling the blank space, the cold stone warming under the hands of someone who would see it as truth. It felt almost ceremonial. A small, quiet victory over years of absence and the letter? I asked finally, letting the thought escape aloud. Does it matter that it was buried? That she hunted in Potri? That she chose to hide it instead of giving it to me? He shrugged, almost imperceptibly. Vent, wait, he said. But names. Names can stand. Even when words are buried, I let that settle. Names, recognition, evidence of existence. Something solid against the years of erasure. I pressed my palm to the frost, as if feeling the weight of both absence and restoration at once. The wind rose, lifting a few dry leaves into the air. They danced across the ground, tumbling over graves, and then settled again. I felt the quiet stretch around me, patient, watchful. We left the cemetery together, the caretaker walking beside me in silence. My steps were slow, deliberate, as if each footfall could imprint my presence on the earth. Behind us, the headstone waited, empty no longer, soon to bear my name. I paused at the gate, looking back once. Frost still lingered in the shadows, but the sun had begun to warm the soil. My voice rose just slightly, and I said my name again, louder this time. The letters hung in the morning air, steady, unyielding, as if the wind itself could carry them to every corner of the graveyard. God, the caretaker didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence felt like agreement. A witness. The stone would come, the name would be carved, and for the first time, my presence would be recognized where absence had long stood. But even as I walked away, a question remained, soft and insistent. Is a name on stone enough to undo the years that no one saw me exist? The cemetery waited, patient, for the answer. The car was quiet except for the gentle hum of the engine and the faint click of the heater. Outside, late afternoon, light filtered through bare branches, casting thin shadows across the dashboard. I held the letter in my hands, folded and familiar, its edges soft from years of waiting. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, the memory of a home I hadn't visited in decades. I breathed in the scent and let it settle. For the first time, I felt the weight of absence lift, if only slightly. The letter wasn't just a message, it was a presence, and for the first time I let it speak without rushing. I unfolded the paper carefully, letting the creases open slowly like unlocking a door I had forgotten existed. Each line of her handwriting carried her voice, gentle, deliberate. There was no anger, no pleading, only honesty layered with regret. My mother had written not to justify, not to explain herself fully, but to leave a path back to something I had lost, acknowledged. I leaned back against the seat, sunlight warming my hands through the paper. The edges crinkled softly as I held them. I noticed details I hadn't before, the way she curved letters, the small loops in my name that made it uniquely mine. She had written as if she were speaking directly into my chest, hoping I would hear what had been unspoken all those years. Outside, the world was quiet, not because it was empty, but because it seemed to be listening too. The sound of leaves brushing against the windshield, the faint hum of tires on the asphalt, all felt deliberate, as if even the road recognized the moment I was having. I began to read slowly, tasting each word. She wrote about nights filled with decisions, conversations she had been forced to have, things she had been told to hide. She spoke of choices made in the name of peace and how that peace came at the cost of truth. Each sentence carried weight, but beneath it was tenderness, care that I hadn't expected. I traced the letters with my fingertip as if touching them could pull the past closer. She had buried the truth, yes, but she had also left it waiting. She had believed, somehow, that I would return when I was ready, that I would understand the spaces she had filled with silence. The realization hit me slowly. The letter wasn't a message frozen in time. It was an offering handed back to me after years of absence. I felt the quiet in my chest, the part of me that had wondered if I had ever mattered at all. It stirred, a hollow I had carried for decades began to fill, not entirely, but enough to breathe again. I noticed the paper trembling slightly in my hands, not mine but the letter's own quiet life. Every fold, every mark, every faint stain spoke of intention and waiting. She hadn't sent it to me immediately. She had left it in the earth, like a promise buried until I could recognize it. I sat there in the car, letter open, and realized it did more than explain the past. It returned my place in it. For years, absence had been my companion, my name missing, my voice unheard. But here, in the careful loops of her handwriting, I was visible again, recognized, a presence restored. The thought made me tremble slightly. What do you do with a belonging you never knew you lost? My name had been erased from stone, my presence denied in rooms that once belonged to me. Yet this letter, folded and waiting, offered something more subtle but infinitely stronger. Proof that I had always been part of the story, even when others tried to write me out. I read each line again slower this time, letting the tenderness seep into me. She wrote that truth waits even when buried, that some things cannot be rushed, that she believed in my return, in my readiness to hear it. It was both guidance and confession, and it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't known I could. The car was still quiet. The heater ticked softly, a steady heartbeat beneath my thoughts. Outside, shadows lengthened, the day preparing to yield to night. But inside, I felt lightness. Not joy, not relief entirely, but a soft, persistent recognition that the story I thought I had lost had never left me. I folded the letter back carefully, pressing my hands to it once more. It felt heavier now, full of intention, full of belonging. I placed it beside me on the passenger seat and stared through the windshield at the fading light, at the moving on without noticing. A question lingered, gentle but insistent. Now that the truth was returned, what do I do with it? How do I carry a belonging I never knew I had, a recognition I had been denied for so long? Secondir Dowsen Jen Dumdinanga. I started the car, engine low and steady, and drove forward. The road was quiet, the shadows long. The letter rested beside me, a tether to the past and a promise of presence. It had given back more than words. It had given me myself. And as the sun dipped lower, I whispered my name into the growing twilight, letting it settle, letting it exist. The letter, the truth, the acknowledgement, they were mine now. The journey wasn't over. But for the first time in decades, I felt whole enough to begin. The first light of morning crept through the bare trees, brushing frost-tipped grass with gold. I stood at the cemetery gate, coat collar pulled high, breath fogging in quiet clouds. The grave stretched ahead, orderly, silent, each one a small monument to someone remembered. My stone remained blank, my name absent, yet the cold didn't feel cruel anymore. The letter rested in my coat pocket, heavy with paper and cedar scent, and I pressed my hand against it. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of presence rather than absence. The world seemed to hold its breath, letting me take my first steps away from what had been erased. I walked slowly along the narrow path between headstones, boots crunching softly on the gravel, 1900 gravel, letting the sound mark my movement without disturbing the quiet. The frost beneath my feet glistened, shrinking with the rising sun, exposing dark soil and tiny leaves curled in stillness. Every breath I drew felt deliberate, as if the air itself had been waiting for me to claim it again. I paused at the edge of the stone without a name. My fingers lingered on its cold, smooth surface. For so long, that emptiness had been a hollow in my chest, a proof of erasure, of neglect, of things unspoken. Yet now I could touch it and feel something different, possibility, acknowledgement, and a quiet permission to move forward. The caretaker was distant, tending to a distant plot, silent but observant. I nodded, not needing words. There was no ceremony here, no rush, only the simple act of being, present, breathing, existing. The letter in my pocket was not a shield or a claim, it was a tether. A quiet reminder that what had been buried, hidden, and delayed still had a life beyond the earth and stone. I leaned slightly, looking down at the frost melting into dark earth, imagining the stone filled with my name, Summer Day. Yet today I didn't carve, didn't demand, didn't mark. Instead, I let the emptiness speak its own truth. The years of absence had shaped the space, yes, but absence no longer felt like erasure. It felt like a pause, a breath, a place waiting. I ran my fingers along the letter in my pocket, feeling its folded edges like an old pulse. My mother's words had returned more than explanation. They had returned a sense of belonging I hadn't known I missed until now. I thought of all the moments she had written about, of the careful choices, the silences, the truths she had buried. And yet here I was present, witnessing the quiet acknowledgement that had waited for me to arrive. The sun climbed higher, spilling warmth across the stones and illuminating dust motes in the air. Shadows shrank and softened, revealing patterns I had never noticed before. The curve of a path, the leaning of an old tree, the faint imprint of footsteps that had come and gone long before mine. Even in absence, life had continued here. Even in silence, presence had endured. And a factual frapper nocturne furis. I let my gaze linger on the blank stone, imagining letters carved into it, the slow, deliberate formation of my name, each line a declaration of existence. But for now, I didn't need that. The acknowledgment I carried in the letter, the quiet witness of the caretaker, the breath of sunlight over frost, it was enough. Some truths don't require display, they simply need recognition, a gentle witness, a quiet moment to exist. The letter warmed slightly in my hand as I folded it again, smoothing the creases that had waited decades to be touched. I felt the tug of forgiveness, not my mother's, not the world's, but my own. Forgiveness for absence, for silence, for choices made and unmade. I had come here to reclaim a place that had always belonged to me, even if no one had noticed, even if my name had been omitted. The cemetery itself seemed to sigh as I walked away. The wind stirred through the trees, soft and deliberate, carrying a faint scent of soil and cedar. It was as if the land had been waiting, not for vengeance or acknowledgment, but simply for my return. And now I was leaving, carrying my place with me in the folds of paper and the quiet rhythm of breath. I stepped onto the path leading out, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots a gentle percussion. Frost shimmered in the sunlight, then gave way to the earth beneath, dark and fertile. My eyes lingered on the unnamed stone one last time. It remained blank, yes, but it no longer felt like a wound. Instead, it was a space of patience, of waiting, of quiet acknowledgement that names can follow, presence cannot be erased. I slid into the driver's seat, placing the letter beside me on the passenger seat. Its weight was comforting, grounding, more proof of life than any carving could ever be. I started the engine and felt the car move forward, the cemetery shrinking behind me, trees arching overhead like As the road unfurled, I whispered my name softly, letting it roll over the empty fields and sunlight-warmed earth. My voice didn't demand recognition, it didn't need it, it existed. And somewhere between the turning of the tires and the rustle of leaves in the breeze, I wondered, was this place waiting for my forgiveness or simply my return? Either way, I had given it what it had been waiting for, quiet acknowledgement and the courage to leave the ground unburdened. The road stretched ahead, open and patient. And I drove into it, carrying the past gently, knowing that some things, once recognized, never truly vanish.